Hello, I'm Janice Holt Giles. I was born March the 28th, 1905 in Altus, Arkansas. I was named after a Revolutionary era book that my mother was reading at the time, Janice Meredith. My parents were John and Lucy, and they were teachers in the Oklahoma Indian Territory. I had one brother and one sister, and we spent most of our childhood there. But when I was 12 years old, we moved to Fort Smith, Arkansas. That is where I graduated from high school. And in 1923, I met Otto Moore, and we were married. We were divorced in 1939, but we did have one daughter, born in 1924, named Elizabeth. Elizabeth, in 1944, married Nash Hancock, and they have 3 sons. In 1941, I was looking for a job. My father had passed away, and I was back in Arkansas trying to help my mother when I got a job at the Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Louisville as a secretary. So me and Elizabeth moved there. In 1943, I took a bus trip to Texas to see a favorite aunt of mine. And on this bus trip, I met Henry Giles. He was 11 years older than I, but we hit it off and became fast friends. And we corresponded through letters while he was serving in the military. Luckily, he caught that bus because it was raining. He was on his way back to Texas, to the base, and he'd been hitchhiking, which was what he usually did. But in Bowling Green, it started to rain, so he hitched the ride. And it was a 48-hour bus trip. So we had a lot of time to talk and get to know each other. And we corresponded for 2 years. He wrote 634 letters to me in the 2 years that he was overseas. We corresponded, we got to know each other, our love grew, and on October the 11th, 1945, the very day he returned home from overseas, we were wed. We had a happy life there in Louisville, and we lived there until 1949. We moved back to Adair County, which was Henry's ancestral home. We moved within 2 miles of where his family settled this area in 1803. We decided to build a home. So we took 4 pioneer log cabins and made it into one home. I wrote about this in a couple of books that me and Henry wrote together. They were A Little Better Than Plum and Around Our House. I wrote books and Henry farmed, and we lived a quiet, peaceful life. My first book was published in 1950, and it was The Enduring Hills. Between 1950 and 1975, I wrote 24 books. Some fiction, some nonfiction, some autobiographical. We had a lot of time to write, and I enjoyed it. I wrote about some of the family that we lived around in our community, and anything that interested me. Some of my books were The Enduring Hills, Miss Willie, Tara's Healing, The Kentuckians, Plum Thicket, Hannah Fowler, The Believers. I wrote one under the name John Garth. It was The Heel Man, but later in 2000 it was published under my name. I died of congestive heart failure on June the 1st, 1979, and was buried here at the Caldwell Separate Baptist Church. Henry joined me here on October the 1st, 1986. Our home has been restored and is not far from here at 380 Sprout Springs Road, and they would love to come for you to visit. It's a beautiful place, and they've done a lot to restore it. They can tell you a lot about my life there. And the library, the Adair County Public Library, has a lot of information about me there, and they would love to share it with you. I appreciate you coming to visit me today. Come back anytime. Thank you.
Welcome to the Anderson Cemetery, where I, Daniel Tribu, have been resting since 1840. I am honored that you are still interested in learning about my life and the things that I accomplished while living my 80 years of life. Let's go back to my home in Columbia, the town that I founded when I was 67 years old, writing my memories and my recollections while my mind was still sharp of the days of coming into this land called Kentucky and the years that I spent here on earth. Let me tell you quickly about the life of me, Daniel Tribu. I'll begin my story at the beginning, taking you back to when I was born on March the 31st of 1760. In Chesterfield County, Virginia, on the waters of the James River. I, Daniel, was one of 15 children of my parents, John James and Olympia DuPoy Tribu. We lived on land that my grandfathers had settled after they fled France. The first time that I heard of this land called Kentucky was from my brother James. I was 17 the first time that I came here to Kentucky. 7 of us, my brother James, 15 years older than I, leading the way, coming through the Cumberland Gap and making our way to Fort Boonesborough on the Kentucky River, and then making our way to Ben Logan's Fort. And there, that spring, we raised a crop of corn. There were many trips back and forth in those early days. It was a time when there was Indians and bear and buffalo and elk. It was a time of danger, and there was some narrow escapes. I went back to Virginia from this land called Kentucky several times, and when I was still young, I served in the militia in Virginia during the Revolution. Served in the Revolution and was mostly a sutler, that's what they called us, who sold the necessities to the troops. I provided the necessities of the troops: rum, brandy, hard cider. I made a good turn at it. But I was in a battle at Petersburg, and I was there at Yorktown whenever George Washington and General Cornwallis made the surrender. Oh, that was a sight to see. Continental Army lined as far as you could see. Militia, red coats marching to lay down their arms. It was a sight to see, and I was there. Shortly after the war, I married a daughter of Colonel Robert Haskins. I married his daughter Polly. We called her Mary. Now there was 3 of us Tribu boys that did marry daughters of Colonel Haskins. And Mary and I married the 4th of July of 1782. Shortly thereafter, we began to want to move to Kentucky. And we moved to Fayette County, Kentucky. And I ran a mill on the waters of the Greer Creek. Shortly thereafter, that part of Fayette County was cut into Woodford County. And there was more and more people coming all the time to the bluegrass. And we decided that we wanted to move here to the Green River country. Been here back in the earlier days, and I knew the land. And three of us, my brother Stephen and my sister-in-law, we bought 666 2/3 acres in the Green River country on the waters of the Skin House Branch in Greene County. We built a log church. There we cut the trees and we built a log church. We named that church the Russell Creek Baptist Church. 'Twas some later on that we changed the name. Colonel Haskins had worshiped back in Virginia in a church called Mount Gilead. And we changed the name from the Russell Creek Baptist Church to the Mount Gilead Church. And I hope that that church still stands. We worked hard in those days. It was about 1800 when I, Daniel Tribu, was asked to help to form a new county. And we cut off 780 square miles of Greene County to form a new county. It was me, Daniel Tribu, Creed Haskins, and William Cowell that followed up the Russell Creek, and we found a branch, and we found a place that was well watered by several good flowing springs, and it was where two buffalo roads did cross. And we decided that was a good place to start a town. We bought 50 acres from Blackmore Hughes, and we chose the name of Columbia. The county was going to be named Adair for General John Adair, a worthy man that William Casey had served with in the legislature. I served in this new county as sheriff and justice of the peace and operated a tavern and many capacities in those early days. It was in 1820 that Mary and I built this house overlooking the little town of Columbia. And we've lived here, and I'm now 67, and I have been spending most of this year writing down these recollections of these early days about the things that happened to us in those early days and the happiness and the disappointments that we've had. Later on in my life, I had to move from Columbia. Mary died, and I spent my last days there in Haskinville, not far from the place where I have rested, and made my last days with my daughter. We lost our home later on. Couldn't pay the taxes. Made my last days with my daughter. And then, on September the 10th, 1840, the end came for me, Daniel Tribu. I hope by your visiting my resting place and visiting my home in Columbia that you've learned more about the life of Daniel Tribu.
My name is Shastia Daisy Keltner. Now, everybody just calls me plain old Daisy. They never really knew my first name, but it was Shastia. Now, my mom and daddy, my daddy was Robert Oliver Keltner, and he was born in 1838. Now, he was in the Missouri Militia Cavalry, and my mama was Cora Bell Vire. She was a Vire, and she was born in 1881. Well, they got married in 1901. And you might wonder why in the world my mama married him. He was 63 years old when my mama married him, and she was just 20. But now he was in the Civil War, in that, like I said, in the Missouri Militia, and he had a little money, and he drew a pension from the Civil War. So back then in the Civil War, a lot of the soldiers, the young men, they all died in the war. So if you wanted to get married, you had to marry somebody that was older. So she married my daddy, and she was 20, and he was 63. Now, I came along about 2 years later on Valentine's Day, and I was the sweetest little Valentine baby you ever saw. I was born on February the 14th, 2 years later after they got married. And when I was 4 years old is when they had the Great Gradable Flood. Now, that was in 1907. Now, some of you might remember that flood. Gradable was a big, booming town back then. We had a bank, and we had a funeral home and a mill and all kinds of stores. But now when that flood came, a lot of people got washed away in that flood, and Gradable changed a lot then. When I was 12 years old, my daddy gave me a house and 7 acres. Like I said, he had a little money, so he gave me that house and 7 acres. And he had said he always wanted me to have a home to live in, so that's why he gave me that house. Now, when I was 18 years old, I married Creed Wooten in 1921, and we had little Frances Marie. Now, she was born with an abscess, and it's got a lame that long, and I can't tell you what it is, but it was an abscess in her neck, and it cut off her airway. So she only lived a month and 4 days after that. Well, we did something back then that people just unheard of didn't do. Things just didn't work out, and we got a divorce. Now, my daddy died in 1921, right before Christmas, and he died just a month after little Francis did. But he was 83 when he died. He actually lived a pretty long life if you look at it. And Mama didn't die until 1936. Now, she was 55 when she died, so, she lived quite a while. But anyway, after I divorced then, I met Henry Marvin Keltner. Well, everybody just called him Marvin. And and speaking of Marvin, where in the world did you get off to? He was here with me a little while ago. What? Well, he's over there looking to see if this graveyard needs mowing. He used to mow this graveyard, along with a lot of more graveyards around here. He's over there seeing if it needs mowing. I guess some of it does. It's getting a little weedy. But anyway, he was married, and he had 2 little girls. He had little Ruth and little Ruby, and his wife was just 18 years old. And they had she was pregnant with another baby, and she had him. It was a little boy that time, but she died in childbirth, and so did the little boy. So he was left with Ruby and Ruth, and so we married in 1925. Now, Ruby did just fine, but little Ruth, when she was 8 years old, she had a ruptured appendix, and she died from that. But we went ahead and we raised Ruby from the time she was little till she was grown. And I was 25 when I married him, and he was 30, but anyway. And after we got married, there was still a bank down there in Gradable. It was right next in the corner of the yard of the house that Daddy gave me, which is where we lived all my life practically, but it was right there in the corner, and it was a big 2-story brick bank. It was a pretty bank. And one night I was laying in the bed, and I heard the office commotion, and I didn't wake up Marvin, because I knew if I did, he'd go running out to see what in the world was going on, and I was afraid he'd get shot or something, so I didn't tell him. But they robbed the bank that night. A lot of people lost their money in that bank and never did reopen after that. Then, we had this man that lived down the road from us, and everybody called him Preacher Clark. Now, he really wasn't a preacher, but that's what they called him, Preacher, and we had a radio. I guess not many folks back then had a radio or anything, but we did, and we'd sit at night, and listen to the radio. And he'd come up there, and he'd sit with us, and he'd sit till it got really late. And me and Marvin, we'd get awful tired, and Marvin'd say, "Daisy, you reckon we ought to go to bed so Preacher can go home?" And we'd get up and go to bed and leave preacher sitting there, and he'd listen to the radio till he got tired, I reckon, and he'd get up finally, he'd turn the radio off, and then he'd walk on back home down where he lived. Well, me and Marvin, we had 4 children. Other than little Ruby that we raised by his first wife, we had 4 children. We had our first child was Philip Oliver. Now, he was named after my daddy, Robert Oliver. And then our next one was Geneva Bell, and she is named after my mama, Cora Bell. And then we had Joseph William. Everybody called him J.W. And then our last one was a little girl named Brenda Carroll, and everybody called her Little B. And Little B, she was born with Down syndrome, because I was in my 40s when I had her, and they told me that she wouldn't live but just a few years and never walk and never talked. While Little B just flourished. She was the sweetest little thing. Everybody in the county knew Little B. And we took such good care of her that she just died this year. She died just this February at the age of 69. I guess she showed them doctors, didn't she, what she was going to do. Well, my one daughter, Geneva, she's 85 years old. She's still living. She lives in Louisville. She married a Dahoney, and he's done passed away. But anyway, she lives in Louisville. She's still living up there, and she's 85 right now. Well, anyway, in 1959, I became the postmistress down at Gradyville, and we had one little room post office. It was a little white, just a little clapboard building. Well, that was the hangout, and people would come, and we had this little bench sitting out front, and we'd sit out there. I guess it was called, the gossip place. They'd come get their mail, and then all these old men would sit out there and they'd whittle and gossip all day. They had the biggest time. And I did that for 15 years. Now, normally, when you turn 70, then they didn't want you to be the postmaster or the postmistress or anything. But they let me stay on, a few more years. So I did that till 1974, and I retired from that. But anyway, and they sold that little post office, and my son Philip, he bought it, and now my granddaughter Kathy has it. It's just like it was then, that same little post office, although it's been moved. And I tell you, another thing I was really noted for was making cakes. Well, I made the best cakes in probably 10 counties. The best one I ever made had a brown sugar homemade icing, and everybody loved that cake. And I took cakes all over everywhere. Took them like over to the nursing home or to the doctor's office and around businesses and stuff. There wasn't a person in Adair County hadn't had one of my cakes, I don't guess. And everybody knew when I come I was bringing a cake, because I took them everywhere. And them cakes was so good. Well, back then they had a thing, the radio station, local radio station up here, WAIN, they had a thing called the Good Neighbor Award. Well, my granddaughter Kathy, she was a spring chicken back then, not so much anymore, but anyway, she wrote a letter into the radio station because they had that Good Neighbor Award thing going on. And she told about me taking them cakes everywhere and all the stuff I did, such as that. Well, don't you know I won that award? I tell you what, I was just tickled pink with that award and kept that award for years. And then in my later years, I gave it to my granddaughter. And now here she's still got it framed in their house, that she's kept it. So anyway, I was mighty pleased with that award. And then, me and Marvin, we had a good long life, and we lived in that house that Daddy gave us, down there, well, most all of our life until we just got to where we had to be put in the nursing home. His mind gave out, and my body sort of gave out, but I knew everything, But anyway, I lived then till 1994, I guess it was. I was 91 years old, that's a good long life. And then Marvin, he lived 2 years later. Marvin loved to eat ham meat, country ham meat, and biscuits, and all that thickening gravy, and all that stuff, that's not good for you or nothing. Well, they always told him, said, Marvin said, that stuff's going to get you one of these days, with all that cholesterol and all that stuff. Well, it did. He was 102. But, it finally got him. He died in June, and he would have been 102 in July. So, that ham meat, I guess, finally got him, But anyway, we did. We had a good long life. And anyway, I just wanted to tell y'all all about myself, and I sure appreciate y'all stopping by today. And I know Marvin does, although he's probably over there looking at some of them stones, half of Gradeville's buried down here, and all these are friends and family, and I'm sure he's over there looking somewhere. But he appreciates y'all stopping by too, and it's so good to see you. We'll see y'all later. Bye.
Well, hello. I didn't know there's anybody around. I sneak off up here sometimes just to be where it's quiet. And it's usually cool in the morning, but it's kind of warm today. Actually, I came out looking for a cow. And I'll find her eventually, or she'll get home before I do. Well, let me tell you, if you don't know me, I'm William Hurt. And this is where I am now. And so are all my people. And some of my non-blood relatives are here too. But I settled on this land 50 years before the end of me. And a whole lot longer ago for you. But let me just tell you a little something about me. Because I like to intercept people when they come through here. You know, this is not my land anymore. Not as far as most people are concerned. But I'll always be here. I was the first one here, and I'll be the last one to leave. Now, I was born in Virginia in 1757, or so my parents always told me. Now, my dad, my father, Moses Hurt, lived for years and years and never came to Kentucky. And most of my brothers and sisters stayed in Virginia. But my brother Nathan and I made our way out here after the war. I joined up in Bedford County, Virginia. And I was 22 years old, 1779. Joined up with the 14th Virginia and fought the line. I remember a lot of those old Revolutionary War men that have gone on long before. I saw Washington, heard him talk, saw him drill, do all the things that generals don't do usually. And I was at Valley Forge. That's why my feet are in the mess they're in. Got some frostbite, never have walked quite right since. But that didn't slow me down. Because if you slow down, you die. Now, I was at Monmouth. Of course, that was quite a battle. And there are people who settled around here after me who were there as well, who were from that part of New Jersey. I was at Guilford Courthouse. And I was in Kentucky during the war. And that's where I fell in love with it. My little piece of heaven. I went back after the war and married my wife, Sarah. She was over there beside of me. She is a widow woman, had 2 little boys. Her husband had died from wounds. She was a white before she married. And off in this direction, there was once a big white settlement. And my father-in-law, who lived to be over 100 years old, buried right over on another hill. If it weren't for the trees, we could see him. We have a little conversation every now and then. But in time, Kentucky just kept calling. And by the middle of the 1780s, this land was filling up. Not here. We hadn't got this far west yet. This was real wilderness. But the Conovers and the Whites and the Hurts and the others migrated along. I stayed for a few years in Bourbon County. Liked it there, but I had been down here a time or two. Looked too good. And my white kin, my wife's people, were in Fayette County. They thought they ought to come as well. So in 92, that'd be 1792, a group of us came down here looking about. And And right back in this direction, there's a good creek, good water source, all the timber you could ever want. Plenty of game. And the soil where it was bare of trees was rich, good for farming. So here we came. I came down here with my stepson, John Field. He's just a teenager. And two black servants, Thomas and Rebecca. We built a little cabin right back in there on that knoll. Hacked down a few trees, made it livable. Then the fall of the year, I left them. Went back to Bourbon County to get the family. But that wasn't any 2 or 3 day trip. I wouldn't be back till April or May. I left them here. We had a couple of horses and a cow. And they lived. And they survived. They had to watch out for the Indians. Because they came through here on a regular basis, hunting, traveling, stealing horses. That was a regular thing. And ultimately, I came back with my family in the first wheeled vehicle that came into this county. A group of men came with me as far as Greensburg. Had to have help because the men had to cut down or saw off little trees every here and there so we could zigzag through. There was no road. There wasn't any such thing. There had never been a need for one. And some other men from the Casey's Fort and Butler stations came over to Greensburg and picked us up. Well, picked us up in that they escorted us home safely. Funny thing though, first night out of Greensburg on this way, I let it slip that there's a shoulder of bacon in the cart. And I told them they could have it. Some of them had been out here 4 years or more. No hog meat. Plenty of bears, plenty of buffalo. They ate that bacon, sawed it off, and ate it raw. And said it was the best they ever had. Well, it took us days to get here, but we settled. Came to right there. And in a short time, my claim laid, house built, little young'uns running around. We put in for a mill down on Pettit's Fork. And in time, we built a mill, and that was the first one anywhere around here. Of course, I turned around and sold it later on to one of the Naylor boys. He needed it, and he offered cash money, and that's my way of doing business. Now, in time, I was involved in politics. Did a whole lot of things for this county, and it did a lot for me. In time, my poor old wife, after having 9 children, laid down, and that was the end. 1814. I had little children. Now, most men would have married again within 4, 5, 6 months if there was available wife material. It took me 3 years before I could find one. But I married again and had 6 more children. Of course, I was getting on up in the years as them days. Now, my philosophy of surviving in the wilderness was to fight when you had to, but keep the peace if you could. Now, on my farm here, I had a grist mill. Later on, I had a second one after I sold the first one. I had my own tan yard where I could tan hides, had a shoemaker shop, had carpenters, had my own distillery. We had it all sewed up. Had a little store. And my advice always was to my children, if you don't have to spend money, don't. The only thing you buy is something that you have to survive. And there's not much like that you have to survive. If I had to pay money for it, I did without, or found an alternative. But now I'd trade you all day long, and did. It was a great delight to me to be able to trade horses for anything I needed, and I always did that. Now, when I finally decided to lay down over there myself, I was well-to-do for that day and time. Had a lot of land, a lot of friends, a lot of children and grandchildren. I lived on this land for very nigh 50 years. I don't aim to go anywhere. Not now, but not ever. Now, there's walnuts all around here. If you all want to pick up a little sack full of walnuts, take home with you. They're always good. Put them in your cake in the wintertime, and delicious, delicious. Well, I won't hold you up. I know you got business. I better go look for my cow. Y'all come again.
Hello and good evening and welcome to my Loy Family Cemetery. Everyone here is either a descendant or related. I'm Martin Luther Loy. I was the first Loy to come to Adair County. I arrived in 1822. And my grandfather, also Martin Luther Loy, was the first Loy to come to America. He arrived in 1741 on the ship St. Mark. Our ancestors were French Huguenots, which had as persecution from a series of French kings who tried to enforce Catholic rule. So they decided to flee to America. They, along with many others, took a over 6-month-long voyage that involved many delays at customs houses along the Rhine River, many more stops and delays at English ports, and finally a 8 to 10 week voyage over the Atlantic, during which many of the passengers died. Finally, they arrived in Philadelphia, and he later settled in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia at Loy's shop, where he married my grandmother, Katharina Faust, and they started a family. Later, along with my father John, they moved to Orange County, North Carolina. Let me tell you a little bit about my father John. John was a very big man and had a good reputation as a bare-fisted prize fighter. He was a soldier in the Revolutionary War, and he lived to be 93, which was highly unusual at that time. He married Mary Holt, who was a member of a large landholding family. After they became prompt, dependable, honest farmers with their reputation. I was born in 1775 and grew up and married Polly Sellers, who's right here beside me, in 1799, and we started a family. And I became a potter and a farmer. We decided, after hearing about all the opportunities in the West, that we would go to Kentucky. So we followed the Wilderness Road that had been established by Daniel Boone through the Cumberland Gap. We arrived in Adair County, and temporarily we settled at Egypt in an old church building. I began to look around for red clay soil, which you'll see if you look around here, and I found it here near Gadbury on my farm, which is where the cemetery is now located. We had 3 more children. When we first came to Kentucky, we had 9, so we had a total of 12 children. And I began to become established in my life as a potter. And we added a lot more land and settled into our life here. Let me tell you a little bit about my descendants. We're fortunate that we have thousands of descendants that have contributed to the growth and success of this area. Unfortunately, my youngest son, Sellers Loy, died at age 41 of typhoid fever. He was a member of the Zion Baptist Church, which many of you will know about. One of my grandsons, Robert Garnett Loy, who was a staunch Democrat, as we all were, married into a family of strong Republicans, Mary Susan Harvey. But they were able to overcome this and their religious differences in that they were married over 62 years. They had 15 children and 78 grandchildren. A few other of my notable descendants include the education pioneer Noah Loy, the medical innovator Dr. Millard Loy, the oil man and TV star Jimmy Relaford, the politician Dennis Loy, and the judge Michael Loy. I'm fortunate that a committee of my great-great-grandsons erected this monument to commemorate our lives. I'm proud to be Martin Loy's great-great-great-grandson. We're fortunate that many in our family have spent a lot of time in research and preserving his history. I'd like to read a little quote from one of those researchers, Harvey Loy, that I found very interesting. Contrary to the ambition of many who seek family relationships, these details were not gathered with a view to claiming some mythical inheritance in the old country or to coddle the vain glory of those who would establish some connection with an ancient nobility, but purely and solely through the love of the Loy name and a desire to list the considerable number of people who have borne it in simplicity and integrity. Thank you.